Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Whaling in the 19th Century, The Fluke and the Furious, by Benjamin Lee and Jordan Peace. When many people think of whaling today, they think of the show Whale Wars and are overcome by a strong sense of boredom and an intense compulsion to change the channel, even if no television is present. Whaling itself, though, was a legitimate world industry that provided the material by which the 19th century lit its lamps and made its candles. The act of whaling is indeed an international and ancient endeavor. Much like agriculture, whaling independently sprang up around coastal areas around the world, in such places as Europe, Japan, North Africa, the South Pacific, and the Pacific Northwest. As far as when whaling was developed, archaeological evidence suggests that humans have been hunting whales since at least 6000 BC. This begs the question, why did so many ancient peoples look out into the ocean, see these huge animals, and think to themselves, I don't know why, but that looks tasty. Why anyone ever saw some gigantic beast lurch out from the depths of the ocean and equated it with dinner is something we may never know. But what we do know is how they were able to pull off such a feat. For anyone who has seen the movie Jaws, and for anyone that hasn't, you should, even though it will make you afraid of all bodies of water, including your toilet, you're already familiar with how ancient people went about the whaling process. Essentially, the people would create what amounted to a large soccer ball out of sealskin, tie the ball to a spear or an arrow with a piece of rope, then go out on small boats and hurl the spears into the whale, which would then drag the balls behind it, tiring it out. When the whale stopped, the people would row their boats up to the whale and finish them off. By the 19th century, whaling was a major world industry, and it wasn't because whale tastes so delicious. Whale oil was a major commodity that provided fuel for lamps and wax for candles. An interesting tidbit about whale oil is that it technically isn't an oil at all, but actually, chemically speaking, a liquid wax. Be sure to remember that one if you ever find yourself being mugged by Alex Trebek. During the whaling industry's peak, a half-gallon of whale oil could go for as much as $1.92, and that's in 1854. The whaling industry hunted bowhead whales and right whales, but was especially interested in the sperm whale. The average male sperm whale is 67 feet long and weighs in at more than 60 tons. Of all this weight, as much as 3 tons of it can be whale oil. That's not a lot of oil compared to the weight of the whale, but in 1854, 3 tons of whale oil could sell for nearly $3,000, which equates to about $81,000 in today's money. That's a lot of cash. During the early 19th century, Nantucket was the busiest whaling port in the world. More than 150 ships called the island home. For comparison purposes, the port of Whitby, England had 58 ships, and between 1753 and 1837 brought in more than 2,700 whales. The most famous of all these ships, and not because of its rousing success, was the Essex, which measured 87 feet long and weighed 238 tons. This ship, captained by George Pollard Jr., set out in 1819 on a 2.5-year expedition to the South Pacific that almost from the onset was plagued by bad omens. For instance, 2 days after leaving port, the ship was hit by a rogue wave and nearly capsized. On November 16, 1819, one of the 4 smaller boats that the Essex used to finish whales off was damaged when it was hit by a tailfin, or fluke, of a whale. 4 days later, on November 20th, 1819, a giant bull sperm whale measuring some 85 feet was spotted. This whale would become the stuff of legend. It twice rammed the Essex. Whale ramming was practically unheard of at the time. The whale was able to punch a hole in the Essex below the waterline. Within 10 minutes, the Essex sank. All 21 men aboard climbed into the smaller boats. The whale then left the area, having won the fight by knockout in the first round, and waited for the results of the post-fight drug test, though it was overheard saying if there was a rematch, the whale would eat the ship's children. After nearly a month in lifeboats, the crew spied a small island, which would later be identified as the uninhabited Henderson Island, which is part of the Pitcairn Islands, a British territory. This was a great disappointment to the crew, who were sincerely hoping for the island to be the legendary Candy Island. Within a week, the 21 men exhausted almost all the food on the island, which consisted of no candy, and it was decided that they couldn't stay. All but 3 of the men, William Wright, Seth Weeks, and Thomas Chappell, otherwise known as the skipper, Gilligan, and the professor, got back into the boats and tried to make it to either Chile or Peru. The hope that the 3 small ships would reach South America proved to be unrealistic. Soon, the ship's supplies were running drastically low, and on January 10, 1821, the first man, Matthew Joy, died. As the men continued to die and the supplies ran out, the decision to eat the dead was reached. These acts of cannibalism enabled 5 of the men, including Captain George Pollard and first mate Owen Chase, to survive. Aside from those 5, the 3 men who stayed on the island lived as well, meaning only 8 of the initial 21 men survived. The events of the Essex had a lasting impact on the world, not because of cannibalism or the sinking of the ship itself, but because a man who was not yet 6 months old when the Essex met its fate would write a book that is considered by many to be a great American novel, Moby-Dick. Herman Melville spent time as a sailor, and his novel tells a fictional story much like what happened to the real-life Essex. That is, if you imagine George Pollard Jr. as a psychotic loon, hell-bent on revenge and sporting a stylish peg leg made out of a sperm whale's jawbone. And that's the way it was if you were whaling in the 19th century.